A good translator can start a war with a single wrong word. Sophie Callahan didn't know that yet. She just knew the man across the private dining room was smiling at a sentence that should have made him furious, and something about that smile was the most dangerous thing she had seen all year. The Aldridge room sat on the top floor of a converted textile building downtown, all exposed brick and hand-blown glass fixtures, the kind of restaurant where the wine list didn't have prices printed next to the bottles, because if you had to ask, you didn't belong at the table. Sophie had worked there for 8 months, ever since she'd aged out of the diner shifts that paid nothing and learned that carrying 4 plates on one arm was a skill people would actually pay for. She was 22, quiet in the specific way that made people forget she was in the room, and she had built an entire career out of that forgettableness. She refilled water glasses without being asked. She cleared plates without a word. She had a talent for existing at the exact edge of a customer's attention, close enough to be useful, far enough to be invisible. Tonight, the private dining room at the back of the restaurant had been reserved under a name that made the entire staff go quiet when it appeared on the reservation sheet. Conti. Just Conti. No first name, as if the last name alone was supposed to explain everything. Marcus, the restaurant's general manager, had spent the entire afternoon rearranging the room 3 separate times, adjusting the angle of the single round table until it faced the door just so, running his hand along the tablecloth to check for a wrinkle that wasn't there. He'd pulled the entire evening staff into the kitchen at 4 o'clock and given them a speech about professionalism that nobody needed, because everybody in that kitchen had already heard the name Dario Conti before, whispered in the kind of hushed, careful tone people used for weather systems and men who owned half the city's shipping contracts. Sophie hadn't thought much of it. She'd worked plenty of important tables, senators, a retired baseball player who tipped in $100 bills folded into little paper airplanes, a woman who turned out to be the mayor's ex-wife and spent an entire dinner crying quietly into a bread basket. Important people were still just people who needed their water glasses filled. That was the whole trick to the job. You stopped seeing the name and started seeing the plate. She was wrong about tonight, though. Tonight would turn out to be different from every other table she had ever served, and by the time she understood why, it would already be too late to walk away from it. The reservation was for 7, but Dario Conti arrived at 6:40, early enough to catch the kitchen staff still finishing prep, and he didn't seem to mind waiting in the private room by himself. Sophie was the one sent in to bring him water and ask if he wanted a drink while he waited, because Marcus had decided, for reasons Sophie never fully understood, that she was steady enough not to spill anything on a man who mattered. He was younger than she expected, not the silver-haired, cigar-chewing caricature she'd half-pictured from the way the kitchen staff talked about him. Dario Conti looked to be somewhere in his mid-30s, dark hair cut close at the sides, a charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive suits were supposed to fit and almost never did. He sat with his phone face down on the table, not checking it, which Sophie noticed because almost nobody who ate at the Aldridge room could go 3 minutes without checking a phone. He had the stillness of a man who had trained himself out of restlessness a long time ago. "Sparkling or still?" Sophie asked, setting the water carafe down without letting it clink against the glass. "Still is fine," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, with the faint trace of an accent underneath the American vowels, something that had been worn smooth by years but hadn't disappeared entirely. "Thank you." She poured, careful not to overfill, and turned to leave. She almost made it to the door before he spoke again. "You're new." 8 months, Sophie said, because it felt rude to just leave the sentence hanging. "Not that new." "New enough that Marcus put you in the good silverware station tonight because he's worried the regular girl will roll her eyes at my associates?" A ghost of amusement crossed his face, I noticed the silverware. It's the good set. Sophie didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and something about her silence seemed to satisfy him more than an answer would have. He nodded once, picked his phone back up, and Sophie slipped out of the room feeling like she'd passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. By 7:15, the private room was full. 2 men Sophie didn't recognize sat on either side of Dario, both broad-shouldered, both watching the door instead of the menu, the kind of men whose job clearly had nothing to do with eating. Across the table sat the Italian delegation Marcus had warned the kitchen about, 3 men who had flown in from Palermo 2 days earlier for what the reservation notes vaguely called a business dinner, though the way Marcus's hands had shaken while writing the note suggested it was considerably more than that. The eldest of the 3, a heavyset man named Alfonso Bruno, ran a shipping conglomerate that controlled half the freight moving through 3 separate ports on the Mediterranean, and if the deal on the table tonight went through, it would tie Dario Conti's American operations to Bruno's European ones in a way that would take both organizations to a different scale entirely. And between them, seated at Dario's immediate right, was the translator. Her name was Renata Villa. Sophie had heard Marcus say it twice while briefing the floor staff, the way you'd memorize the name of someone important enough that mispronouncing it would be a disaster. Renata was elegant in an understated way, dark hair pulled into a low knot, a black dress that had clearly cost more than Sophie made in a month. She had a leather portfolio in front of her and a fountain pen she clicked open and shut between sentences, and she spoke with the easy fluency of someone who had grown up moving between 2 languages without ever quite settling into either one. Sophie's section that night included 2 other tables in the main dining room, but Marcus had quietly instructed her to also handle water and bread service for the private room, since the assigned senior server had called in sick an hour before the reservation. It meant Sophie would be in and out of that room all night, refilling glasses, clearing plates, doing the small invisible tasks that kept a dinner moving without anyone noticing the person doing them. She didn't think anything of it. It was just another table. A big one, an important one, but a table. She had no idea, walking in with the bread basket at 7:20, that she was about to spend the rest of the night learning things she had no business knowing. The dinner started the way these dinners always did, with pleasantries stretched thin over expensive wine. Alfonso Bruno spoke almost no English, and Dario's Italian, while serviceable, wasn't fluent enough for the kind of precise, high-stakes negotiation the evening required, so every sentence passed through Renata first. She would listen to Alfonso's rapid, Sicilian-accented Italian, nod, and turn to Dario with a smooth, polished English translation. Then Dario would respond, and Renata would turn back to Alfonso and render it into Italian. It was a rhythm, back and forth, and Sophie watched it happen the first 2 times she came in with water and thought nothing of it at all. It was the 3rd time, clearing the appetizer plates, that something in the room snagged at her attention, like a thread catching on a nail. Sophie's grandmother, Teresa Callahan, born Teresa Marchetti, before she married an American soldier and crossed an ocean to a life she spent the rest of her years half homesick for, had raised Sophie for 4 years after Sophie's mother passed when Sophie was 11. Nonna Teresa didn't speak much English in the house. She cooked in Italian, cursed in Italian, told stories in Italian, and by the time Sophie moved back in with her father at 15, she had absorbed the language the way children absorb things, without meaning to, without studying, simply by being present for it long enough. She'd never told anyone at the restaurant. It had never come up. It was a private thing, a piece of her grandmother she kept folded away like a photograph in a drawer, not for showing off, not for anyone. So when Alfonso Bruno leaned forward, jabbed a thick finger toward the center of the table, and said something sharp and clipped about the percentage split on the port fees, a sentence Sophie caught clearly as she set down a fresh basket of bread, A sentence that was, in plain terms, an accusation that Dario's numbers didn't add up, and an implication that someone was trying to cheat him. She expected Renata to translate it as exactly that. Instead, Renata turned to Dario with an easy, reassuring smile and said, "Mr. Bruno says he's very pleased with the structure of the proposal and looks forward to finalizing the paperwork this week." Sophie's hands went still over the breadbasket for half a second too long. She told herself she'd misheard. She told herself Italian dialects varied wildly, that Sicilian in particular could sound harsher than it meant, that she was a waitress who'd absorbed a language from a grandmother a decade ago, not a certified interpreter, and that she had absolutely no business second-guessing a professional translator in a room full of men who could end her employment with a single word to Marcus. She finished setting the breadbasket down, refilled 2 water glasses, and left the room with her pulse ticking a half-beat too fast. She stood in the server station outside the private room for almost a full minute, gripping the edge of the counter, running the sentence back through her head. Non tornano I conti. The numbers don't add up. She was sure of it. She'd heard her grandmother use nearly that exact phrase 100 times, usually while going over grocery receipts at the kitchen table, muttering about the butcher shortchanging her. It wasn't an obscure phrase. It wasn't something she could have invented out of nerves. She told herself it didn't matter. It wasn't her table, not really, not in the way that meant anything. She refilled her water pitcher and walked back in anyway, because someone had to bring the next course, and because some small, stubborn part of her wanted to hear it again, wanted to be wrong, wanted this to be nothing. It was not nothing. Over the next 40 minutes, as Sophie moved in and out of the room with plates and glasses, and the quiet invisibility she had spent 8 months perfecting, she caught 4 more moments where Renata's translation didn't match what had actually been said. Small things, mostly. Alfonso mentioning a delay at one of the ports that Renata rendered as ahead of schedule. A comment from one of Alfonso's associates about wanting a clause reviewed by his own lawyers that became, in Renata's English, a comment about how impressed they all were with Dario's legal team. Each mistranslation on its own could have been an honest mistake, a simplification, the kind of smoothing over a good interpreter sometimes did to keep a conversation moving. But together, laid end to end, they formed a pattern, and the pattern only moved in one direction. Every time Alfonso raised a concern, a doubt, a demand for more favorable terms, Renata turned it into something warmer, softer, something that made Dario feel like the deal was further along and more secure than it actually was. Sophie didn't know what it meant yet. She didn't know who benefited from Dario walking into a signature with a false picture of what he was signing. But she knew, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her stomach, that someone in that room was lying to a man everyone in the kitchen was too afraid to even discuss in full sentences, and that the lying was deliberate. By the time the entrees were cleared, Sophie's hands weren't quite steady, and she'd started making the kind of small mistakes that never happened to her. Refilling a glass that was already full, forgetting which side to clear from. She caught Marcus watching her with a raised eyebrow from across the dining room and forced herself to breathe, to slow down, to look like nothing at all was wrong. The problem was simple and impossible at the same time. If she said nothing, she would spend the rest of the night watching a man get quietly cheated out of something that mattered enormously to him, in a language he trusted a stranger to carry faithfully across the table. If she said something, she would be a 22-year-old waitress accusing a professional interpreter of deliberate deception in front of the most dangerous man to ever sit in the Aldridge room's private dining space, with absolutely nothing to back her up except a phrase she'd learned from a grandmother who'd been dead 6 years. She thought about the money on the table. She thought about her job, her rent, The fact that a man like Dario Conti could have her fired with a single phone call if he decided she was a nuisance rather than a witness. She thought about walking back into that kitchen, finishing her shift, going home, and letting whatever was happening in that room happen without her. Then she thought about her grandmother's voice, sharp and certain across a kitchen table 30 years gone, saying the same words Alfonso Bruno had just said to a man who had no idea he was being lied to. And something in her, quiet and stubborn, decided she couldn't do it. She couldn't clear one more plate and pretend she hadn't heard what she'd heard. She just had no idea how to say it without ending her career, or possibly something worse. Her chance came at the end of the main course, when Dario stood to take a phone call in the hallway just outside the private room, one hand raised in apology to the table, his security peeling off the wall to trail a respectful few steps behind him. Sophie was coming the other direction with a tray of dessert menus, and for a moment the hallway was empty except for the two of them, the low murmur of the dining room bleeding through the wall, the security men keeping a professional distance by the elevator. Dario finished his call, slid the phone into his jacket pocket, and would have walked straight back into the private room if Sophie hadn't planted herself, quite deliberately, in his path. "Mr. Conti," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, though her heart was slamming hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. "Can I say something? It'll take 10 seconds. He stopped. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her over the water glasses earlier. That same unhurried attention, except now there was a faint edge of curiosity to it, the look of a man who did not often get stopped in hallways by waitresses. "Go ahead." She glanced past him toward the private room, toward the closed door, toward Renata Via somewhere on the other side of it, with her fountain pen and her portfolio and her easy, fluent smile. She lowered her voice until it was barely more than breath. "Your translator isn't telling you what he's saying." The words came out in a rush, tangled and too fast. "Mr. Bruno, 20 minutes ago he said something about the numbers not adding up, and she told you he was pleased with the proposal. And there've been other things too, smaller things, but they all go the same direction. I don't know why, I thought you should know before you sign anything." For a moment, Dario said nothing at all. His face didn't change, didn't flicker with alarm or disbelief or anger, and the stillness of it frightened Sophie more than any reaction would have. She had a sudden, sinking certainty that she'd made an enormous mistake, that she'd just accused a professional of sabotage in front of the wrong man for no reason he had any cause to believe. "How do you know Italian?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. "My grandmother," Sophie said. "She raised me for a few years. She only spoke Italian at home. Sicilian mostly, some standard Italian mixed in. I don't advertise it. It's not really relevant to being a waitress." "It's relevant tonight." He studied her for another long beat, and Sophie felt herself being weighed, measured, the way she imagined he weighed everything, every person, every offer, every risk. "What exactly did you hear?" She told him, quickly, quietly, keeping her eyes on the hallway rather than his face, because it was easier to get the words out that way. The comment about the numbers, the delay at the port turned into ahead of schedule. The demand for outside legal review turned into praise for his legal team. She was careful to say what she'd heard and not what she thought it meant, because she genuinely didn't know what it meant, and she was afraid of overstepping into territory where she had no business guessing. When she finished, Dario was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, "Say something to me, in Italian. Anything." Sophie blinked, thrown by the request, but she understood it a second later. He wanted proof, or at least a demonstration, something more than her word alone. She reached for the first thing that came to mind, one of her grandmother's old kitchen phrases, worn smooth from years of repetition. Chi non risica, non rosica, she said. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Her grandmother used to say it every time Sophie hesitated over something small and stupid, whether to raise her hand in class, whether to try out for a team she wasn't sure she was good enough for. Something shifted in Dario's expression. Not quite a smile, but close to one, a kind of recalculation happening behind his eyes. My grandmother used to say that too, he said. Different island, same stubbornness apparently. He glanced back toward the closed door of the private room, and when he looked at Sophie again, whatever softness had been in his face a moment ago was gone, replaced by something colder and more focused. What's your name? Sophie. Sophie Callahan. Sophie. He said it like he was filing it away somewhere permanent. Don't say anything else tonight. Don't change how you're serving the table. Act exactly the way you have been all night. Can you do that? Yes. Good. He straightened his jacket, the motion small and automatic, and for a moment he looked less like a man about to walk back into a room where he might have just discovered he was being deceived, and more like a man simply preparing for a difficult conversation, calm and methodical. Thank you, Sophie. He walked back into the private room, and Sophie stood alone in the hallway for several seconds, her hands still shaking around the tray of dessert menus, wondering if she had just done something brave or something catastrophically foolish, and suspecting, with the sick certainty of someone who has already crossed a line she can't uncross, that she wouldn't know the difference until it was far too late to matter. Dinner continued for another 40 minutes, and to Sophie's eyes, nothing about it changed at all. Dario resumed his seat, resumed the easy rhythm of the negotiation, laughed at something Alfonso said, poured wine for the table himself at one point in a gesture that seemed almost theatrically warm. Renata kept translating, her fountain pen clicking open and shut, her voice smooth and unhurried. And if she noticed anything different in Dario's demeanor, she gave no sign of it. Sophie came and went with plates and glasses, keeping her eyes down, her movements steady, doing exactly what she'd been told, acting like nothing had happened at all. But she noticed things now that she hadn't noticed before. She noticed that Dario had started asking Renata to repeat certain phrases, framing it as simple attentiveness, a man making sure he understood correctly. She noticed that he occasionally responded directly to Alfonso in his own imperfect Italian before Renata could translate. Short, simple sentences that didn't require her at all, watching Alfonso's face rather than hers when he did it. She noticed, near the end of the meal, that one of Dario's security men had quietly stepped out of the room and returned 15 minutes later with a slim folder that he passed to Dario under the table, and that Dario glanced at it once, briefly, before sliding it beneath the leather portfolio in front of his own seat. Dessert came and went. Coffee came and went. The Italian delegation made noises about being tired from travel, about continuing the conversation the following day, and the dinner began winding toward its natural end the way these dinners always did, with handshakes and jacket straightening and the particular relief of men who had spent 3 hours performing warmth they didn't necessarily feel. It was as the delegation was gathering coats near the private room's entrance that Dario finally spoke, and the shift in his voice was so subtle that if Sophie hadn't been listening for it, standing near the server station with a tray of empty espresso cups, she might have missed it entirely. "Renata," he said, still in English, still perfectly pleasant. "Before everyone leaves, I want to go over the port fee percentage one more time, just to be certain I have it correctly for my own notes." Renata's expression didn't change, not really, but Sophie, who had spent an entire evening watching that expression for exactly this kind of shift, caught the half-second of stillness behind her eyes. "Of course, Mr. Conti." "Ask Mr. Bruno to state the number himself, slowly, in Italian." There was the faintest pause before Renata turned to Alfonso, and when she did, her voice had lost a fraction of its earlier ease. Alfonso, oblivious, repeated the number he'd stated twice already that evening, a number that, translated correctly, was nearly 6 percentage points different from the figure Dario had written in his own notes an hour earlier, a figure Renata had given him. Dario didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand, didn't reach for anyone, didn't do any of the things Sophie half expected from every mafia story she'd ever half heard in hushed kitchen gossip. He simply looked at Renata for a long moment and said, in Italian this time, slow and deliberate, clearly for the benefit of everyone in the room who understood the language. "Sei stata pagata per fare questo, o l'hai fatto gratis?" Were you paid to do this, or did you do it for free? The color drained out of Renata Villa's face so fast it was almost startling to watch. Alfonso Bruno, catching the sentence in full, went rigid in his chair, his eyes darting between Dario and his own translator with the dawning horror of a man realizing he might have spent the entire evening being managed by both sides at once. One of his associates began speaking rapidly, urgently, and the calm, orchestrated warmth of the dinner collapsed within seconds into something far tenser, voices overlapping in two languages at once. Renata tried to recover, her voice climbing half an octave as she reached for the leather portfolio in front of her, some explanation about simplifying complex terminology for clarity, about the natural liberties an experienced interpreter took in high-pressure negotiations. Dario let her talk for almost 30 full seconds without interrupting, which somehow felt crueler than cutting her off would have. And then he held up one hand, and she stopped. "I had someone pull your firm's client list an hour ago," he said, switching back to English now, his voice still even, still unhurried, though there was a hardness underneath it that hadn't been there before. He nodded toward the slim folder his security man had brought in earlier. "You've done work for a company called Vestal Freight twice in the last year. Vestal Freight is owned, 3 shell companies removed, by a man who has spent 2 years trying to buy the port access I'm about to sign for tonight. I wonder how much they paid you to make sure I signed away 6 percentage points I didn't actually agree to." Renata said nothing. Her hand had gone still on the portfolio, and in the sudden silence of the room, that stillness said more than any denial could have. "You're going to gather your things," Dario continued, "and my men are going to walk you to your car, and you are never going to work in this city again in any capacity that requires anyone to trust a word out of your mouth. That's the mercy version of tonight, Renata. Take it." Sophie, standing frozen near the server station with a tray she'd forgotten she was holding, watched Renata Villa rise from the table with her hands trembling, watched her gather the portfolio and the fountain pen with the jerky, mechanical motions of someone whose mind had gone somewhere far away from her body, watched Dario's 2 security men fall into step beside her without a word, escorting her toward the elevator with a kind of grim, silent courtesy that was somehow more unsettling than if they'd shouted at her. No one raised a hand. No one raised their voice again after that first quiet question. It was, Sophie thought, the strangest kind of danger she had ever witnessed. A room full of men whose reputations promised violence, and instead there had only been 3 sentences and a folder and a woman walking out with her career in ashes and not a single mark on her. Alfonso Bruno, once the door had closed behind Renata, turned to Dario and said something rapid and apologetic in Italian, gesturing helplessly, clearly mortified at having nearly signed away his own credibility as much as Dario's money. Dario answered him calmly, in his own imperfect but functional Italian, and whatever he said seemed to settle the older man considerably. The rest of the delegation, initially furious, gradually softened into something closer to relief, the specific relief of men who had nearly walked into a disaster and were grateful, above almost everything else, that someone had caught it in time. It was nearly 11 by the time the private room finally emptied, the Italian delegation gone, the security men gone, the restaurant's kitchen staff long since sent home, only a skeleton crew left to close down the dining room. Sophie was clearing the last of the coffee cups when Dario appeared in the doorway again, jacket still on, tie loosened for the first time all night, looking like a man who'd just spent 3 hours holding something together with his bare hands and had only just now allowed himself to feel the effort of it. "Sophie," he said. She straightened, cups balanced carefully on her tray. "Mr. Conti, you saved me a considerable amount of money tonight. More than that, actually. If I'd signed those terms, Bruno would have found out within a month that his own numbers had been misrepresented to me, and he'd have assumed I was the one who'd tried to cheat him. It would have ended the deal permanently, and it would have made me look like a liar to a man whose trust I need for the next decade of business." He said all of this in the same even, matter-of-fact tone he'd used to order Renata out of the building, and Sophie understood, listening to it, that this was simply how he processed things, not with heat, but with precision. "That's not a small thing you did." "I just repeated what I heard," Sophie said, because it felt important not to overstate it, not to reach for more credit than the situation actually held. Anyone who spoke Italian in that room would have caught it. Anyone who spoke Italian in that room and was brave enough to say something to a stranger with 2 armed men behind him, Dario corrected. That's a much shorter list. He studied her for a moment, the same weighing look from the hallway, except now there was something warmer underneath it, something that hadn't been there when he was still deciding whether to trust her. "I'd like to thank you properly. Not tonight. You're clearly still working. But properly." "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to." A faint, almost tired smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I'm going to anyway. Is that all right?" Sophie looked at him for a long moment. This man who had just calmly dismantled someone's career with 3 sentences in a language he barely spoke, who had thanked her with the same unhurried steadiness he'd used to threaten a translator, and she felt something she couldn't entirely name settle into place. Some quiet certainty that whatever came next, it would not be simple, and it would not be nothing. "I get off at midnight," she heard herself say. He nodded once, like that was answer enough, and left her standing in the empty private dining room with a tray full of coffee cups and the growing, uneasy suspicion that she had just stepped into something far larger than a single dinner shift. He was waiting outside when she finished, leaning against a black car parked at the curb a respectful distance from the restaurant's front doors, his security nowhere in sight, as if he'd deliberately sent them ahead so the moment wouldn't feel like an ambush. Sophie stepped out into the cool night air, her apron folded over one arm, and felt a small jolt of surprise at finding him still there, still waiting, in the same unhurried way he seemed to do everything. "I thought you'd be halfway home by now," she said. "I wanted to ask you something, and it felt like the kind of question that shouldn't happen over a dinner table with an audience." He straightened off the car, hands in his pockets, and for the first time all night he looked almost uncertain, which struck Sophie as strange on a man who had spent 3 hours radiating absolute control. How does a girl who grew up with a grandmother who spoke Sicilian dialect end up carrying plates in a restaurant like the Aldridge Room instead of working as an actual interpreter? You could make 3 times what you're making now. Sophie shrugged, the motion smaller and more defensive than she meant it to be. "I never finished the certification. My grandmother passed when I was 15, and after that there wasn't really anyone to keep the language alive with. It got quieter in my head every year." I can still hear it, still understand it fine, but actually using it, really using it, professionally, that takes a kind of confidence I never built. Waitressing is easier. Nobody expects anything from you except good timing and a decent memory for orders. You underestimate yourself, Dario said. Badly. I watched you catch 4 separate mistranslations tonight in a dialect most native speakers under 50 don't even use fluently anymore. I got lucky. Your translator got sloppy near the end because she thought she'd already won. Maybe. He didn't look convinced. Or maybe you're better than you think you are. And it's easier to believe you're not, so you don't have to try and risk finding out otherwise. He said it without judgment, simply as an observation, the way he might have noted the weather, but it landed somewhere uncomfortably accurate in Sophie's chest anyway, and she found she didn't have a quick response for it. What was the question? She said instead, because it felt safer than sitting with the one he'd just asked without meaning to. Have dinner with me. Not a work dinner, not a thank you dinner either, though I do owe you one of those. Just dinner. He held up a hand before she could answer, a small, wry gesture. I know how that sounds, coming from someone who spent tonight ending a woman's career in front of you. I'm not going to pretend my life is simple, or that it doesn't come with complications most people would run from. But I'd like to know you better than as the waitress who saved my deal. If that's something you're interested in. Sophie thought about her rent, her tired feet, the 8 months of invisibility she'd built like armor between herself and every important table she'd ever served. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen, the phrases that had sat quiet and unused in her chest for years until tonight cracked them back open. She thought, mostly, about the fact that she was standing on a sidewalk at midnight, being asked to dinner by a man whose name made grown adults lower their voices, and that some reckless, curious part of her wanted to say yes before she'd even finished weighing the risk. Okay, she said. Dinner. Somewhere that isn't the Aldridge room, though. I'd like to eat a meal I don't have to serve. For the first time that night, Dario laughed. A short, genuine sound that transformed his face into something younger, less guarded. Deal, he said, and offered her a ride home, which she declined, because some habits of caution took longer than one honest evening to unlearn. And he accepted the refusal without pressing, simply nodding and telling her he'd call the number Marcus had on file for scheduling shift coverage, which made Sophie laugh despite herself at the sheer absurdity of a man like him going through official restaurant channels to ask her out. Word moved fast in the kind of world Sophie had accidentally wandered into. It took exactly 9 days for the trouble to find her, which was, she would later think, a remarkably short amount of time for a life to fall apart and reassemble itself into something entirely new. The dinner had happened 3 nights after the incident at the Aldridge room, a quiet, unglamorous place Dario picked specifically because it was the opposite of everything he usually did business in. A small, family-run trattoria on the edge of the neighborhood, where the owner greeted him by first name and didn't seem remotely impressed by who he was. They'd talked for 3 hours about nothing important. Her grandmother's recipes, the particular loneliness of growing up bilingual in a house that eventually went quiet, his own grandfather, who had built the first version of the Conti shipping business out of a single boat and a stubborn refusal to be told no by men who had every intention of telling him no. It had been, against every expectation Sophie walked in with, one of the easiest conversations she'd had in years. There had been a second dinner after that, and a third, and somewhere in the space between them Sophie had started noticing a black car idling near her apartment building at odd hours, always a respectful distance away, never approaching, and she'd assumed, correctly as it turned out when she finally asked him about it, that Dario had quietly put a man on watching her building without telling her, the same way he seemed to watch everything, careful and unannounced. She should have been more careful about being seen with him in public. She understood that only in retrospect, the particular naivety of someone who had never had to think about who might be watching a restaurant doorway. She hadn't hidden their second dinner. She hadn't hidden the third. And somewhere in the network of people who tracked Dario Conti's movements the way sailors tracked weather, someone had noticed a young waitress from the Aldridge room appearing at his side twice in 1 week, not long after his longtime translator had abruptly and mysteriously vanished from the city's interpreting circuit. It didn't take a genius to connect the two events. It took, apparently, exactly one phone call made by someone still loyal to whoever had been paying Renata Villa for her services, to whoever had lost 6 percentage points of a very lucrative shipping deal because a waitress happened to remember her grandmother's kitchen Italian. Sophie found out about the connection the hard way, on a Tuesday afternoon, walking home from a daytime shift with her earbuds in, and her mind on nothing more sinister than what she was going to make for dinner. The man who fell into step beside her on the sidewalk 2 blocks from her apartment was unremarkable in every way that mattered. Average height, gray jacket, the kind of face that vanished from memory the moment you stopped looking directly at it. He didn't grab her arm. He didn't raise his voice. He simply matched her pace and said, conversationally, as if they were old acquaintances catching up, "You've been spending time with Mr. Conti lately?" Sophie's stomach dropped straight through the sidewalk. She pulled one earbud out, kept walking, kept her eyes forward, every instinct she'd built over 8 months of reading difficult tables screaming at her that this was a moment to stay very, very calm. "I don't think I know you." "You don't need to." His voice stayed pleasant, almost bored, which was somehow worse than if he'd sounded threatening. "You cost some people a great deal of money a couple weeks ago. A dinner, a translator, a very expensive misunderstanding. I'm sure you remember." He let that sit for a beat before continuing. "Nobody's going to touch you. That's not how this works, and frankly, it would be bad business for everyone involved. But you should think very carefully about whether you want to keep being seen with him. Attention has a way of attaching itself to people standing too close to something valuable, and attention isn't always kind." "Is that a threat?" Sophie asked, and was faintly surprised at how level her voice came out, given how hard her heart was hammering. "It's a suggestion," the man said. "Consider it a professional courtesy from one working person to another. You seem like a smart girl. Smart girls know when to step back from something that isn't theirs to be involved in." He slowed his pace, letting her walk on ahead without him, and added, almost as an afterthought, "Vestal Freight sends its regards." By the time Sophie reached her apartment building, hands shaking as she fumbled her key into the lock, the man had disappeared entirely, folded back into the ordinary foot traffic of the street as if he'd never existed at all. She stood in her hallway for a long moment, back against the closed door, breathing hard, running the conversation over and over, trying to decide if she'd just been threatened, warned, or simply reminded of exactly how large and unfamiliar the world was that she'd wandered into without meaning to. She called Dario before she'd even fully decided to. He answered on the second ring, his voice instantly sharpening the moment he heard the edge in hers, and by the time she'd finished recounting the conversation, the gray jacket, the unremarkable face, Vestal Freight sending its regards, his tone had gone very quiet and very controlled in a way that frightened her more than the man on the sidewalk had. "I'm coming to get you," he said. "Pack a bag. Not because you're in serious danger tonight. You're not, and I mean that. They wouldn't have sent a man to talk to you politely on a public sidewalk if the plan was anything more direct than that. But because I'm not leaving you in an apartment with a broken sense of who might be watching it, and neither one of us is going to sleep well tonight if I don't know exactly where you are." "Dario, I have a job. I have a lease. I can't just—" "You can," he said, not unkindly, but with a certainty that left very little room for argument. For a few days at least, until I understand exactly who sent that man and exactly how worried we need to be. After that, it's entirely your choice. But for tonight, please, let me come get you." She thought about arguing further. She thought about her independence, the careful, hard-won self-sufficiency she'd built out of years of nobody else being reliably there to catch her. The same self-sufficiency that made the idea of needing anyone's protection feel like a small defeat. But she also thought about the flat, pleasant, unhurried way the man in the gray jacket had said, "Vestal Freight sends its regards," like a line rehearsed for exactly this purpose. And she found that her stubbornness, for once, wasn't quite strong enough to override the plain good sense of the offer. "Okay," she said. "Come get me." The house Dario brought her to sat on a quiet stretch of coastline 20 minutes outside the city, a long, low structure of pale stone and dark wood that looked, from the outside, more like something out of an architecture magazine than the fortified estate Sophie had half expected. There were security cameras, subtle ones, tucked into the eaves and the garden walls, and there were men who moved through the property with the quiet, alert bearing of people whose job was to notice things before anyone else did. But the house itself felt less like a bunker and more like somewhere a person could actually breathe. Dario gave her a guest room on the second floor, all soft linens and a wide window looking out over the water, and told her, in the same even tone he used for everything, that the door didn't lock from the outside, that she was free to leave whenever she wanted, that the only thing he was asking was a few days of patience while his people figured out exactly how deep the trouble ran. Sophie, standing in the doorway with her single, hastily packed bag, found she believed him without having to work very hard at it, which surprised her almost as much as everything else that had happened in the last 2 weeks. The days that followed settled into an unexpected, almost domestic rhythm. Dario worked most mornings from a study on the ground floor, a room lined with charts and shipping manifests that looked, to Sophie's untrained eye, more like the office of a logistics executive than anything out of the stories the kitchen staff used to whisper about him. He came out for lunch every day at the same time, without fail, and seemed to genuinely look forward to it in a way that struck Sophie as unexpectedly sweet for a man who spent his mornings untangling threats against her safety. On the third day, she found him in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, badly attempting to make espresso with a machine that clearly intimidated him, muttering under his breath in a mix of English and Italian that made Sophie laugh out loud from the doorway before she could stop herself. "You're going to break that," she said, crossing the kitchen and gently nudging him aside. "My grandmother had one just like it. There's a trick to the portafilter." "I built half my company navigating union contracts and port authority regulations in 3 languages, Dario said, watching her hands with the focused attention of a man determined to learn something he'd clearly failed at before. "I refuse to be defeated by a coffee machine." Nonna Teresa used to say the same thing about her bread machine right up until it defeated her completely, and she went back to kneading everything by hand. Sophie tamped the grounds down, locked the portafilter into place, and stepped back to let the machine do its work, the rich, dark smell filling the kitchen. "There, you just needed someone who actually knew what they were doing." "I seem to require that a lot lately," Dario said, watching her rather than the espresso, and something in the way he said it made Sophie's face warm in a way that had nothing to do with the steam rising off the machine. One evening that week, Dario found her on the back terrace with a paperback she wasn't really reading, watching the tide come in over the rocks below the garden wall, and instead of interrupting, he simply sat down beside her in silence, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and waited until she was ready to talk rather than filling the quiet himself. It was such a small thing, that patience, but Sophie noticed it the way she noticed everything, quietly, carefully, filing it away as evidence in an argument she hadn't realized she was still having with herself about whether any of this was safe to trust. "You're doing the thing again," Dario said eventually, not looking at her, his eyes on the water. "The thing where you go very still and very far away, like you're deciding how much of yourself is safe to hand over." "I don't know if I do that," Sophie said, though she knew exactly what he meant, because it was the same stillness she'd perfected over 8 months of carrying plates through rooms full of people who never once looked at her twice. "You do it at the espresso machine. You did it in the hallway outside the private room, right before you told me the truth about Renata, and you did it just now." He turned to look at her then, and there was nothing demanding in his expression, only a kind of open, unhurried patience that made it easier, somehow, to keep talking. "You don't have to stop doing it on my account. I'm not in a hurry. I just wanted you to know I'd noticed." Sophie looked back out at the water for a long moment before she answered. "My grandmother used to say that the quiet ones survive longest. She meant it as a compliment. I don't think I ever stopped to ask her if surviving and living were supposed to be the same thing." "They're not," Dario said simply, and left it there, and Sophie found that she was grateful for that too, that he didn't try to fix the thought for her, only set it gently down beside her own, and let her decide what to do with it in her own time. They talked over that week, in the unguarded way people talk when the ordinary rules of a first few dates have been skipped entirely in favor of shared meals and quiet mornings, and the particular intimacy of someone else's kitchen. Sophie learned that Dario's father had died when Dario was 26, thrusting him into a role he hadn't fully wanted yet, that he'd spent the years since trying to steer the family's holdings toward legitimate shipping and real estate ventures, with the same slow, patient determination he'd used to dismantle Renata Villa's career in 3 sentences. He wasn't, Sophie came to understand, a man who enjoyed the reputation that trailed him. He simply carried it, the way you carry a family inheritance you didn't ask for, but can't set down either, and did his best to make something steady and lasting out of it, rather than something that would frighten his own children someday, if he ever had any. Dario, in turn, learned about Nonna Teresa's kitchen table, about the 4 years that had shaped Sophie more than any other stretch of her life, about the particular grief of losing the one person who'd made a foreign language feel like home, and having nowhere left to speak it. He listened the way he seemed to do everything, fully and without interruption. And Sophie found herself talking more in that week than she had in the 8 months since she'd started at the Aldridge room. The careful invisibility she'd built for herself slowly, gently, coming apart in his presence without her quite noticing it happening. It was on the 5th day that Nico, the broad-shouldered man Sophie had come to recognize as Dario's closest and most trusted associate, walked into the kitchen during breakfast with a folder tucked under his arm and the particular expression of someone who had finished a job and wanted credit for it. "We found him," Nico said, setting the folder on the table beside Dario's coffee cup. The man who approached Sophie. "Name's Callum Reyes. Works freelance for whoever's paying. Mostly intimidation jobs that stop short of anything that'll draw police attention. He was hired directly by a man named Grant Ostro, who runs Vestal Freight's day-to-day operations. Ostro's the one who paid Renata Villa. He's been trying to buy into the port access for 2 years and got desperate when he found out the Bruno deal was about to close without him." Dario flipped open the folder, scanning the contents with the same careful, unhurried focus he brought to everything. And Ostro himself? Sitting in his office right now, probably feeling very clever. Nico's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. Word travels fast when you send a man to threaten a waitress on a public sidewalk in broad daylight. That's not subtle. That's a man who thought he had more room to maneuver than he actually does. "Good," Dario said, closing the folder. "Set up a meeting. Tomorrow, if his schedule allows it. Someplace public, someplace with witnesses. I want this handled with paperwork and lawyers, not anything that gives Ostro a story to tell about being threatened by dangerous men. I want him to understand, in writing, with his own attorneys present, exactly how badly this ends for him if anyone connected to his company comes within 100 feet of Sophie Callahan ever again. Sophie, sitting across the table with her coffee cooling in front of her, felt a small, strange rush of relief at the specificity of it. Not violence, not the shadowy threats she'd half expected from a man in his position, but paperwork, lawyers, a public meeting designed to box a frightened, greedy man into permanent, documented retreat. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of solution that fit the version of Dario Conti she'd come to know over the last week, rather than the version the kitchen staff used to whisper about in hushed, nervous tones. "You don't have to do all this for me," she said, once Nico had left the room. "I could have just stayed away from you until it blew over. It would have been simpler." "Simpler for who?" Dario asked, and there was an edge to the question that surprised her, quiet but unmistakably firm. "I'm not interested in a version of this where you disappear from my life because a man I used to do business with decided threatening a 22-year-old waitress on a sidewalk was an acceptable business strategy. That's not simpler. That's just me pretending I didn't notice. And I notice everything, Sophie. It's the entire reason I'm still alive and still running a business at all. I noticed the moment you walked into that private dining room 8 months of experience deep in the art of being invisible. And I noticed the moment you decided, against every reasonable instinct you must have had, to stop being invisible for exactly as long as it took to save me from a very expensive mistake. I'm not going to pretend I can unnotice that now, just because it's inconvenient." Sophie didn't have an answer for that, not right away. So she reached across the table instead and set her hand over his, and he turned his palm up to meet hers, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, the quiet of the kitchen settling around them like something solid and warm. The meeting with Grant Ostro happened the following afternoon in a conference room at a law firm Dario used for exactly this kind of careful, bloodless resolution, and Sophie wasn't present for it, though Dario told her about it that evening over dinner, describing with something close to satisfaction the particular pallor that had come over Ostro's face when he realized the meeting he'd expected to be a negotiation was, in fact, a settlement, a signed, notarized agreement barring any contact, direct or indirect, between Vestal Freight and Sophie Callahan, backed by the specific and detailed threat of a civil suit that would bankrupt Ostro's company within a year if the agreement was ever violated. It wasn't the kind of ending the old whispered stories about the Conti family would have predicted, and Sophie found she was deeply, quietly grateful for that. "It's over," Dario told her, once he'd finished recounting it. "You can go home whenever you're ready. Your lease, your job, all of it. Exactly as it was before. Nobody's watching your building anymore. Nobody's going to fall into step beside you on a sidewalk again." Sophie sat with that for a long moment, looking out the wide kitchen window at the dark water beyond the garden, thinking about her apartment with its thin walls and its temperamental radiator, thinking about the 8 months of careful invisibility she'd built there before any of this happened, thinking about how strange it was to be offered her old life back exactly as it had been, as if the last 2 weeks could simply be folded up and put away like a photograph. "What if I don't want to go back to exactly as it was?" she said finally. Dario looked at her carefully, the same weighing look from the hallway outside the private dining room all those weeks ago, except now, Sophie understood, he wasn't measuring whether to trust her. He already trusted her completely. He was measuring something else entirely, something that mattered more. "Then don't," he said simply. "Stay as long as you'd like. Stay for a week. Stay longer than that if it turns out you want to. I'm not going to pretend this is uncomplicated, Sophie. My life comes with things most people would run from: the security, the whispers, men like Grant Ostro who occasionally decide threatening a stranger on a sidewalk is an acceptable business strategy. But I've spent 5 years running this company like it's a legitimate business because I genuinely want it to become one, fully, someday. And I'd like you to see what that looks like, if you're willing to stick around long enough to watch it happen. Sophie thought about her grandmother's kitchen table, about the quiet years of keeping a language and a whole piece of herself folded away because it had felt safer than using it, easier than risking whatever came from being seen fully by anyone. She thought about the 8 months of invisibility at the Aldridge room, the careful art of existing at the edge of every important table without ever quite belonging to the room. She thought about the moment in the hallway when she'd planted herself in front of a stranger everyone was too afraid to speak to and told him the truth anyway, because some things mattered more than the risk of getting them wrong. Chi non risica, non rosica, she said, and Dario laughed, low and warm, and reached across the table for her hand again. Nothing ventured, nothing gained, he agreed. My grandfather would have liked you enormously. I think mine would have liked you too, Sophie said, eventually, after a very long, very suspicious interrogation over dinner. I look forward to it, Dario said, and meant it. And outside the window, the dark water kept moving steadily toward a shore neither of them was in any hurry to reach. 6 months later, Sophie stood in the doorway of the private dining room at the Aldridge room one last time, not as a waitress this time, but as a guest, watching Marcus fuss over a table setting for a party of 2 while Dario waited for her by the window. And she thought about how strange it was that the same room where she'd nearly talked herself out of telling the truth had become the place where an entirely different life had quietly begun. She had finished her interpreter's certification 3 months earlier, mostly at Dario's patient, persistent encouragement, and had already picked up 2 contracts translating for smaller businesses trying to navigate deals with partners overseas. Careful, honest work, the kind her grandmother would have recognized and been proud of. She still worked 1 lunch shift a week at the Aldridge room, not because she needed the money anymore, but because there was something she'd come to genuinely love about the rhythm of it, the quiet skill of reading a table and knowing exactly what it needed before it asked. Sophie Callahan had spent 8 months of her life perfecting the art of being unnoticed. It took exactly 1 honest sentence, whispered in a hallway to a stranger everyone else was too afraid to speak to teach her that being noticed for the right reasons was worth every risk that came with it. If you loved this slow-burn, high-stakes mafia romance and felt every ounce of tension in that private dining room, make sure to hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs a little Italian drama in their life. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter. Drop a comment below. Would you have said something at that table, or stayed quiet and let the deal fall apart? Let us know. See you in the next story.